Welcome to the inaugural episode of the Armchair Atheism podcast. I'm your host, Taylor Carr, and coming up we have an interview with Dan Barker, former minister, published author, and co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. In this first episode, we'll discuss the question that seems like the most obvious question to start with on a podcast of this sort. What is atheism? But before we get to that, some introductions and opening remarks are in order. Who am I, and why am I doing this show? Well, I'm just a city boy born and raised in Texas, where I'm currently attending university with a special interest in religious studies. Although I am an atheist, as the title would suggest, I find religion to be a fascinating subject for study, especially in all that it involves, integrates, and influences, from philosophy and history to ethics and psychology. I was raised by Christian parents and considered myself a believer until the age of about 22, when I left the faith after much deliberation over the Bible, apologetics, and my own standards of reason and evidence. In 2008, following an ethics class that motivated me both to share my views more openly and to expose myself more to alternative lines of thought, I founded the website godlesshaven.com, the official host for this podcast. Shortly thereafter, I started a blog for my less organized ideas, godless-skeptic.blogspot.com, and a YouTube channel under the name TaylorX04. Between these three resources, I have a wide range of content available for reading and watching, including more of my deconversion story, told in the YouTube series My Exodus from Faith. Why I've decided to do a podcast on top of all these other things is a question I still ask myself. However, I'll say it has something to do with the enjoyment I've gotten out of other podcasts, the flexibility that an open verbal discussion seems to have compared to a written format, and the appeal of tossing around different ideas in a manner that, hopefully, provokes some reflection on our own beliefs as well as those of others. So what is armchair atheism, then? The name comes from armchair philosophy, a term used for thinkers who do most of their thinking without collecting data or doing experiments, instead relying upon scholarship that already exists. In other words, an armchair philosopher likes to do his philosophizing without leaving the comfort of his armchair. I chose to call this podcast Armchair Atheism for a few reasons. Currently, I am not a professional anything, so there's some self-deprecating humor there. I also want to keep the discussions relatively down to earth, especially with more complex topics. I would like these episodes to feel like conversations over coffee, rather than confrontational debates, propaganda pieces, or pop radio shows. Most importantly of all, the reason I call this show Armchair Atheism is that I will be producing it from my armchair. Presently, I intend each episode to dive into a particular question or topic with a guest, though this may change over the course of things. What I can promise up front is that this will not be a consistent show. Episodes will not air weekly, bi-weekly, possibly not even monthly. The reason for this is that I would rather these interviews reflect personal passions of mine than simply fill a time slot. I think that will make for a better experience, but it also takes no small amount of work to do a podcast like this, and I'm not going to allow for any expectations, let alone demands, for regular content. I realize this may cost me some listeners, but if you want to keep up with the show, there will always be announcements on Godless Haven, through Facebook, and on iTunes. With all that said, let's get on to my interview with Mr. Dan Barker. Dan Barker is a former preacher turned atheist activist who currently serves as co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to upholding the separation of church and state and to educating the public on subjects related to unbelief. He has authored several books including Losing Faith in Faith, Godless, and The Good Atheist, and also runs his own weekly podcast called Free Thought Radio. I'm very sorry to say the first 5 minutes or so of our interview did not get recorded. During that time, I spoke to Dan about being a pastor, beginning to doubt, and eventually leaving the faith. If you'd like to hear this part of his story, I'll recommend reading his books Godless and Losing Faith in Faith, or checking out his bio at ffrf.org. Now we pick up with Dan explaining some of his experience with walking away from Christianity.
Yeah, well, just like you, today I would say the same thing you're saying, that I didn't have the Spirit because there is no such thing. But at the time, I really thought I did. I was convinced I did. And, I saw what I was convinced were answers to prayer. And I prayed and talked, and I felt this voice within me. And you know what I mean? It just felt real. So I know what those Christians are telling you because they're feeling these things. They can't imagine that what they're feeling is actually a delusion. So they're projecting that you must therefore not have actually felt the same things they're feeling. Well, I did feel them. But to answer your real question here, it was a process, and I can't explain it all in a few minutes, but I was a Christian pastor and associate pastor in 3 different churches. I was a missionary to Mexico. I was a cross-country evangelist. I was a Christian songwriter and Christian record producer. And when one of my musicals was published, when I was in my mid-20s, I became this sort of, not a celebrity, but I became a Christian composer. And so I was getting invited to a broader cross-section of Christian churches than before. Before, I was preaching mainly born-again, fundamentalist, evangelical-type churches, if you know what I mean. I was, preaching to the people who believed that kind of preaching. And, of course, going out in the street corners and going into prisons as well. But when my musicals were published, suddenly I was getting invited to a broader cross-section of Christianity, not just extreme fundamentalists. I started meeting other flavors of Christians and talking to pastors and religious leaders in churches that were performing my music who didn't have the exact same theology that I did. And that made me really uncomfortable, because I believed, the Bible is the Word of God and it's true, and there's, let there be no divisions among you, Paul said in 1 Corinthians, the 1st chapter. You should all be of one mind. And later in Corinthians, he says, God's not the author of confusion. But I started meeting really good Christians, pastors and other Christians who had a slightly different view of the theology than I did. For example, I met some Christians who thought, and I liked these people. They were good people. I wasn't going to judge them, but they thought that Adam and Eve, for example, weren't really historical people. They thought Adam and Eve couldn't have been historical, and that it doesn't matter. In the same way that it doesn't matter if there actually was a prodigal son. Jesus made up a story, and it's okay to make up a story because it's not the historicity of the story that matters. It's the moral lesson that's being taught. No one thinks there actually was a prodigal son, you know what I mean? And so if Jesus could do that with the parables, these Christians thought, well, that's what the early Israelites did with Adam and Eve. There really wasn't an Adam and Eve. It's a parable story. And I was shocked. I really was shocked. I thought, how can you call yourself a Christian and doubt the factual claims of the book of Genesis about an Adam and an Eve? And they said, well, we know from evolution that there could not have been a first man and a first woman. And even if there were, it wouldn't have been out of the Middle East. It would have been out of Africa. We know that now. And so I felt sorry for those Christians. I thought they were heretical. You know what I mean? I thought they were, denying the power of the Word of God. But what happened was I didn't throw away belief in Adam and Eve. What I did was I said, okay, relax a little bit. There's different Christians with different points of view, and we don't have to hate each other and start holy wars over some difference of opinion like they used to do. Like John Calvin actually had his friend and co-reformer Servetus burned at the stake over something much less than that. And what happened to me was I started meeting a broader cross-section of Christians, and I thought, well, I don't have to stop fellowshipping with these people because we have a disagreement, over some maybe minor point like that. And that started a process of softening and liberalizing and maybe maturing or becoming more sophisticated in my theology, where I eventually learned there's not just one Christianity. There's probably as many Christianities as there are Christians. And that started a kind of gradual migration across this theological spectrum, starting with the fundamentalists until I became a little less, a little less absolutistic or a little less hard-nosed, less heaven and hell and more about love and living your life, more moderate, and eventually I swung across that spectrum. It took 4 or 5 years. I became a little more mature, more of a moderate Christian and less of a, speaking in tongues, flaming fundamentalist Pentecostal. And I thought, wow, I'm growing up, I'm maturing. And I kept moving across that spectrum and eventually fell into more of a liberal kind of belief that, maybe it's not just the prodigal son and Adam and Eve. maybe God himself is just a parable. Maybe the whole thing is just one big, does it matter if it's true? I mean, what matters is the moral lessons, right? So after about 5 years of that, I popped all the way across the spectrum. And the line I like to use is that I threw out all the bathwater, and then I looked in the tub and I found out there's no baby there. It's all just words. It's all just metaphor and figure of speech, and some of it's beautiful, some of it's ugly, and so I became this kind of, all by myself, this kind of baby atheist, and I didn't like the word atheist. I didn't know if I would even like any other atheists. But it was just an intellectual thing that happened in my mind. And I'm sorry, that's sort of making a long story very short, but that's kind of what happened. I intellectually moved across that continuum.
Well, that's actually kind of funny, because one of the things that first made me start to question my more conservative beliefs and eventually led me into atheism was also that I had an exchange with a Christian who accepted the theory of evolution, and he very patiently explained to me all the evidence that was there and met my objections. And so one of the criticisms I've also seen of you on the internet from obviously fundamentalists is that you've been liberalized. And I mean, how do you even respond to a criticism like that?
Yeah. Well, to say that I was liberalized is actually a compliment, so I'll thank them for the compliment. I don't know if this means that much, but the word liberal is in the Bible more than once, at least the King James. The word conservative is not. So there's liberality, freedom, flexibility. Christians are always asking non-believers to be flexible and consider the alternative and test all things and hold fast to that. They're always asking people to relax their preconceptions. So that's a good thing. You want people to be free to think and look at all points of view. So that's what happened to me. So, but part of that process that I telescoped too much was learning, first of all, that the Bible itself, contrary to what I used to preach, is actually not a reliable source of truth. I used to say it was, because if God wrote the Bible, then it's the absolute truth. But the historical inaccuracies, the anachronisms that are in the Bible, the scientific mistakes that are in the Bible, the internal contradictions that are within the Bible, and not only internal contradictions, but the moral contradictions, the supposed immoral teachings that are in that book. When you're a true believer, it's kind of like, you're a fan of your own football team. You're always going to win, yeah, they're great. Or maybe a battered wife who still thinks her husband's a good man. You don't see, there's a kind of blinding that happens where you don't see anything other than your devotion and your loyalty and your faith, and you make it all things work together for good, the Bible says. And so that was part of my process to painfully realize that as I was open to truth and more liberal in my thinking, the Bible itself does not stand up to careful scrutiny. And then the arguments, the lack of an evidence for a God. Let's quit kidding ourselves. If there really were evidence, real evidence, like I used to preach there was, then by now, somebody should have won the Nobel Prize for pointing that out. That would be a fact of reality. It would be a fact of science. It would be on the table. We would all look at it, and we'd all throw up our hands and go, yep, there's some hitherto unknown force in the cosmos, and science has to change, medicine has to change, philosophy has to change. But that hasn't happened. It's a delusional thing where believers think they have this evidence, but when you submit it to careful scrutiny, it evaporates, it disappears. There's no good argument for a God, and there's about a dozen that have been put forth. The first cause and the design arguments and the so-called ontological arguments and the moral arguments and so on. And then there's the presuppositional arguments as well. And then those are just bad. Like Bertrand Russell said, they all just boil down to bad grammar is what they are. They're not really, they're not really good arguments for a God. And most theists admit that. If they were good arguments, there would be no atheists. Why are there atheists? Why are there people who are looking at this and still are not convinced? And then there's no good answer to the problem of evil. And I say this a lot in my debates, that all you have to do is walk into any children's hospital and there's no God. Just look at the way these kids are suffering. They die at the same cruel, random rate as any other kid, even if their parents are praying devoutly, prayer does not make a difference, not a measurable difference. You will have some, coincidences from time to time. And if you didn't, that would be a miracle. You got to have some coincidences. There have to be some times when it looks like prayers are answered, or you would need a real scientific explanation for why that doesn't happen. And then there's no agreement among believers is another strong argument. If there's a God, and if it's important for him to communicate to us, then why do no believers agree with each other? Why are there all different opinions and different, why do they fight with each other? Like Paul said, God's not the author of confusion, but the Bible has caused an awful lot of confusion. And finally, the last reason is that you look around the world and there's no need for a belief in God. People live these happy lives, meaningful, productive. The title of my next book is called Life-Driven Purpose, opposite of Rick Warren, Purpose-Driven Life. Millions of good people, tens of millions of people on this continent alone are happy and loving and moral and giving and purposeful and productive without any kind of a belief in God. So, reluctantly I had to just let go of that belief because it just doesn't make sense.
Another one of these supposed explanations that I've seen some Christians give for why they think certain people walk away from faith and become atheists is because they think that we just want to live morally without consequence. It's the whole, you're just an atheist because you want to sin thing.
Yeah, when actually the opposite is true. Since this life is finite and we are going to die someday, that gives us non-believers all the more reason to be moral. It's the believers who have the escape. It's the believers who can sin and get away with it because they can just ask for forgiveness. It's this sort of get out of jail free card that believers have. I used to preach that. So we atheists and agnostics, realizing there's no such thing as cosmic justice or cosmic purpose, realize that since we are biological animals with built-in instincts for altruism and empathy, and we're social animals who because we care about each other have survived to care about each other, that our actions make a difference in the real world. If there's going to be justice, it has to be now. If there's going to be accountability, it has to be now. We can't pawn it off to some future and escape responsibility for our actions. So the people who say that we don't believe in God because we just want to act immoral are actually pointing a finger at themselves. They're imagining that they themselves are the kind of people who, without some cosmic moral restraints, would be out raping and killing and stealing and murdering, when in fact most atheists and agnostics are just basically decent, good people who understand what real morality and real values are all about. And if you look at their lives, you don't see atheists and agnostics out living these horrible, immoral lives. Or if they are, they're no worse or better than Christians or Jews or Muslims. We're all human beings doing the best we can in the world we have, and at least we atheists own up to our own immediate accountability for our actions, while many believers don't. They just pawn it off on a pie-in-the-sky future.
Yeah, what you said reminds me of something that Eric Weilenberg, a atheist philosopher, has said, which is that genuine self-sacrifice seems like it would be impossible on a theistic worldview, because if in the end everybody gets what they deserve, the good go to heaven and the bad go to hell and that sort of stuff because of God's divine perfect justice, then it seems like there's no chance of someone actually foregoing their, so-called ultimate fate and making a genuine self-sacrifice with their life.
Yeah. I do have to say, though, that I do see the, at least emotional or rhetorical impact of the question of those Christians who are raising morality. Because, so Hitler died and there's no justice for Hitler, he's just dead? Well, you and I would say, yeah, Hitler's just dead. He's not sitting somewhere being told what a bad man he was, and, there's no eternal punishment for him. And you and I as human beings would kind of like there to be. I would like somebody to be kicking his butt. We would like to see that kind of cosmic justice. But just because we would like that doesn't mean that it's true. And for me, one of the hardest things to come to grips with is the fact that since morality and justice and purpose and meaning are not ultimate or eternal. I used to think that that's the only way they could make sense is if they were eternal and ultimate, that somehow they are cheapened, that somehow somebody's getting away with something, or in fact there are people getting away with a lot, that our human nature that wants to see the books all balanced, you know, we cry out and demand that those books be balanced in a cosmic eternal way. But when you give that up, that doesn't mean that you're giving up justice or purpose or meaning. You're not giving them up. What you're doing is you are removing them from the cosmic realm into the immediate realm where it really matters. So that if there's going to be justice, it better be now. If there's going to be purpose and meaning, it better be now. And like Bertrand Russell said, just because happiness is not eternal doesn't mean it's any less happy. Just because purpose is not cosmic doesn't mean it's any less of a purpose. In fact, purpose, if it means anything, has to mean something in our real lives today, not in some, you know, weird, unproved, eternal future. So we have to admit that the people that are asking that question are basing it on an assumption that these things have to be ultimate and eternal. In fact, that's what William Lane Craig says in his books. That's what Rick Warren says in his books. That's what they all talk about, that if it's not eternal and ultimate, then it's meaningless and life is a joke and it's nihilism. They're totally wrong about that, but you can see kind of the tenor of their emotional argument there when they ask that question.
Well, and another one of these explanations that I've heard theists give for why atheists leave faith is because they say they want to be loved by people, not by God. But of course, doesn't this presume that God exists, first of all?
Yeah, sometimes people come up to me and say, Dan, Jesus loves you. And sometimes I'll say, well, that's nice. Well, everybody loves me. You know, thanks. I have enough love in my life. That's nice to know. But they're saying it like they think I'm some desperate, lonely person who doesn't have any love. And, gee, if I only knew that Jesus loved me, my life would be meaningful. They never consider the possibility that I might not want to love Jesus back. He might not merit my love. He might not deserve my admiration. And when you look at his words in his life, don't we choose our friends? Don't we choose who we love based on some, you know, lovability factor or some admirability factor? Do we just say, oh, somebody loves me, so yeah, great, you know? But if you look at the words and the actions of Jesus, he said a couple of good things, but on balance, I don't know if I would want to live in the same neighborhood with him. I mean, he was kind of, you know, he was kind of a small town dictator with this paranoia about he that is not with me is against me, and talked about cutting off body parts and a lake of fire and a hell, and that you can't be my disciple unless you hate your family. And, he showed how compassionate he was by suggesting that there are some slaves that you should not beat as hard as others, which I guess makes some kind of sense. You know, I mean, only beat the slaves if they knew better. But he never denounced slavery itself. So, on balance, if people tell me Jesus loves me, I'm not that impressed. You know, and even if there were a God, should I love this creature that would create a hell? Should I love this being whose actions were genocidal and misogynistic and masochistic and, I mean, infanticidal? Look at the Old Testament. Look at the actions of this deity with such an insecure vanity that if you don't worship him on the Sabbath day, he's going to destroy all the crops and kill people who picked up sticks on. You know what I mean? So, these people who say these things are assuming that it's just a given that everybody would want to love and know this God. Well, thanks, but no thanks. I have plenty of love in my life. I don't need the love of human beings. We're social animals, and it's nice. You know, I happen to be the kind of person that I could spend my whole life just alone with some books. That would be fine with me. I'm not desperate I'm desperate to be loved, you know. And maybe when they ask that question, they're revealing something about their own psychology, their own emotional needs that they're projecting back on you and me.
Right. Well, and a lot of the things that God commands in the Bible and the atrocities that he allows in this world would also seem to really make it difficult to understand what is even meant by, goodness or love in the Christian worldview.
Yeah. Well, I used to preach he was a loving but a stern father. He was a giving, loving, forgiving God, but he was also a holy and just God. I'm sure you've heard those sermons. And so he has to be both. But those are just words. If you look at his actual words and actions, for example, in the book of Job, chapter 2, verse 3, you know, where Job's talking to Satan. I guess, what do they meet for coffee once a week or something? But, you know, Satan comes up to God. Have you considered your servant Job, you know? And God said, have you considered my servant Job? He's blameless. There's nobody like him. He's perfect. He even used the word blameless and perfect. So Job was devout, and yet God admitted to Satan, and read it yourself, he's perfect, but you caused me to destroy him for no reason. That's quite an indictment. You know, if you're in a court of law and they ask the defendant, you know, why did you commit this murder? Oh, you know, I had no reason. The devil made me do it. I mean, we would think that person was a moral monster. And the God of the Bible actually admits that for some ego reason of his own, which he doesn't explain, later in the book of Job he says, can you make an eagle? Can you make a leviathan? I'm big and strong and you're not. I mean, that's his only reason, was to show how big, what a big tough guy he is, really, if you read it. It's a horrible book. And if that God exists, then he deserves my disapproval. I have to judge whether I would admire a being like that. And for anybody who say, I destroyed and he killed 10 of Job's children, 10 of them, with the wind blowing, and then he destroyed all the cattle and everything. And then he inflicted Job with torture and boils in that. So that is not good. I don't care how you try to dress it up. That is not a good father, not a good being. That is somebody who, you know, if there is a hell, he should go to hell. He's the one who's committing the crimes.
Well, that seems like a nice segue into the question that I wanted to address for this first episode that seemed pretty intuitive, which is, what is atheism? What does it mean to you? And you've given several reasons for why you're no longer a Christian, but what are some of your reasons for being an atheist?
Yeah, and I also included some reasons why I'm no longer a theist as well, because the lack of evidence, the lack of good argument, the lack of agreement, the problem of evil, and all those things. The problem of evil, by the way, doesn't disprove a God. It only disproves a good God. You know, there might be a God, but he's a real pain in the butt kind of God. But in any event, if God is necessarily good, then the problem of evil is a real problem. But for me, atheism is just a description. It'd be like me calling myself a male. I wouldn't put a capital M on it and say that was my title. Dan Barker is a male. Like that meant something, you know what I mean? It's just a description. It's just, and I suppose for political maybe or PR reasons, we can use that word atheism more like a label sometimes. I'm an atheist. And because when you live in a society that's predominantly religious, then saying that you're an atheist actually means something because of the differential. Maybe someday it won't mean anything. Maybe belief in God will disappear, and so it won't mean anything at all to say you're an atheist. But for me, atheism is simply a description of a person who is not a theist. That prefix a, the Greek prefix a in front of a word, does not mean against. It doesn't mean anti. That prefix a is a privative prefix. It simply means without. If you're amoral, it doesn't mean you're immoral. If you're apolitical, that doesn't mean you're anti-political. That just means you're lacking. So an atheist is a person who lacks a belief in a God. Theism is not a thing. Theism is just a belief. If someone's a theist, they don't have a God. If they're a theist, they have a belief in a God. So an atheist is simply a person who lacks, for whatever reason, and there could be a number of different reasons, and there are, a person who simply lacks a belief in a God or gods. Most atheists would not say, I believe there's no God. I have a belief or I have a knowledge that there's no God. That would be a kind of Gnostic atheism. Atheism, at least the lowercase a kind of atheism, is simply the absence of a belief. Every baby is a lowercase atheist. Every baby who's born does not have a belief in a God. So, by definition, they are atheistic. So, That's what I mean by the word atheist, although we should point out that within that set of people who do not hold a belief in a God, there is a smaller subset of those people who might claim that they do have a belief that there's no God. You might call them capital A atheists. And if you're talking about the God of the Bible, then I'm a capital A atheist. Not only do I not believe in such a being, I know that that God does not exist. Maybe some other God exists, but it would take an infinity to go through all the possible definitions of a God and rule them out one at a time. So in the meantime, since we have to live our lives, I am a lowercase a atheist in general.
So then how would you distinguish, you've been talking a lot about belief and also about Gnostic atheists, so how would you distinguish between atheism and agnosticism?
Yeah, and George Smith's book, Atheism, the Case Against God, really lays it out very clearly if you haven't read it. That was one of the earliest books I read. And it's very simple, although in the common understanding, there's this mischaracterization of agnosticism as some kind of a midway, halfway house between theism and atheism. That's kind of how people on the street think of agnosticism. It's like, you're not taking a position either way, you're just going to be in the middle, right? That's not what agnosticism is at all. Although some people think it's a kind of a, convenient thing to say so you don't have to make a decision. You say, well, I'm just agnostic. But the difference is, theism and atheism are addressing the question of belief, as you rightly pointed out. Gnosticism and agnosticism are addressing the question of knowledge. They're two separate questions. Agnosticism is not addressing the question of what you believe. It's a question of what do you know or claim to know or claim to know what is knowable even. That's the whole question of Gnosticism or agnosticism. So it turns out that you can be both an atheist and an agnostic. When it comes to the question of do you believe in a God, you can be theistic or atheistic. The question of whether you know there's a God or not, you can be Gnostic or agnostic. So in reality, most agnostics, like me, I'm an agnostic because I don't claim to know that there's a God or that there's not. I'm agnostic. But most agnostics in reality are atheistic. To be an atheist means you don't have a belief in a God. So even if you call yourself an agnostic, let's say you're a person who really likes the label agnostic, right? You can't escape the question of your belief. If you call yourself an agnostic, I can still ask you, okay, you're an agnostic, but do you or don't you have a belief in a God? Even if you're an agnostic, you still have to answer that question. And if you can't say yes, I have a belief in a God, then you are by definition atheistic. You're an atheistic agnostic. There are some agnostics who are the other way around. Blaise Pascal, the philosopher mathematician, was what we would call a theistic agnostic. Pascal, Pascal's wager. Pascal was a Roman Catholic who said, and I'm simplifying it, but basically he said, we can't know if there's a God and we don't know if there's a God, but we're better off believing that there is. So he was honest. He said, I'm an agnostic, but I'm choosing to believe anyway. So he's what you would call a theistic agnostic. So when you're looking at the question of the difference between agnostic and atheist, remember to keep in mind the distinction between knowledge and belief. And then you can be both. And in fact, most atheists would say they are also agnostic.
So I'm sure you've heard this pretty well-known response that atheism is just another religion, which a lot of theists seem to say. How would that relate to what you've already said about belief, especially about atheism, on your understanding being the lack of belief in gods?
Yeah, in general, we would have to say no. Of course, it's not just another religion. You can see how believers, and I used to be this way, frame the whole discussion in terms of their own minds, right? I'm religious, and there's Buddhists, and there's Hindus, and they're not Christians, but they're religious, and there's Jews, they're not Christians, but they're religious, and there's these, and they're not, so atheists are not Christians, but they're religious too. There's sort of dichotomy thing that happens, that everybody has to be some kind of a religion. But you've heard the old joke that if atheism is a religion, then baldness is a hair color. Or off is a TV channel. You know, I mean, it's totally opting out of any religion and all religions is what atheism basically is. Atheism doesn't have a creed. Atheism is not a moral philosophy. Atheism does not pretend to make you a better person. In fact, there are a lot of crappy atheists in the world. Atheism doesn't have, regular worship services, or I should jump ahead and say that there is a tiny group of atheists who do meet for services. And in fact, there are a couple of atheist churches in the country, right? And that's fine. And I think that's more of an IRS thing, because if you can be a religion, then you can be tax exempt and you can have your church meetings and your atheistic stuff. But in general, though, atheism, of course, is not what you would call a religion. There's no transcendent world. There's no supernatural God. There's no angels. There's no heaven. There's no hell. There's no missionaries. There's no, any of what you would call a religion. Most atheists are just simply human beings. They might call themselves humanists, which is also not a religion, but they're simply lacking a belief in a God. It is not a religion.
Yeah, I know that the people who often say that about atheism being a religion tend to provide pretty loose definitions of religion, certainly not those that are generally agreed upon by any scholars. I know that defining religion is a pretty sticky subject for anthropologists and philosophers and the like.
Yeah, although you can maybe purely legally, let's say. I know Michael Newdow, who is a firm atheist, has an atheist church in California, and for legal reasons, even though he admits, he and I disagree in a friendly way, we disagree about this, he admits atheism is not really a religion, not in any philosophical or any real sense, but legally it can be considered a religion, because if the First Amendment guarantees the freedom of religion, then we atheists have that same freedom of religion, meaning atheism is a non-religion. It's a non-religious religion, if you want to call it that legally.
So if atheism, as you put it in Godless, is not a philosophy of life, and it offers no values, and if it predicts nothing of morality or motives, then from where do atheists get their moral views and their life philosophy?
Yeah, well, I can't speak for all atheists, and that's one of the nice things about free thought, is that it's not a creed. There's not some atheist, thing that we all look up. Oh, here's what we believe. Here's how we get our morality. Oh, okay. We all think for ourselves, basically, which is actually better than having an absolutistic morality. Before you ask or answer the question of where do non-believers get their morality, you can certainly point out that believers don't have any leg up on that. The Bible's not a moral book, and Christians don't have any corner on morality or moral giving. So it's not like atheists are starting off disadvantaged in any way. The most you could say is that atheists are just as bad as Christians, because Christians are not any better. However, and even though I can't speak for all atheists, and would never pretend to, because that would make me, like a bishop of atheism or something, which is absurd, I do know thousands of atheists, and I've read hundreds of their books. And in general, I think we can say that in general, and it doesn't apply to all atheists, but in general, most atheists would describe themselves in a moral perspective as humanists. In other words, value doesn't reside or originate from some cosmic being outside the natural world. Value originates and resides within the human species, within our natural world. God is not the measure. Humanity is the measure. And it's a good thing that God's not the measure, because the qualities of God are really immoral qualities to measure by. Humanists say that value and morality come from the attempt to live in a world that has the least amount of harm and violence and the most amount of understanding and compassion and empathy. That's what we mean by morality. Morality isn't just a look-up list or a bunch of commandments, inadequate commandments, by the way. Morality is assessing your actions in context in the natural world to see if those actions are actually resulting in less overall necessary harm than is required. And, I guess you could call that a moral philosophy, and we all might disagree about where the harm is or where our priorities lie, but no one can claim that there is an absence of a natural moral philosophy available to atheists and agnostics, because in fact most atheists and agnostics do live their lives in a good moral way without religion, and most of us feel like better than religion because we've rejected religion. We have a clearer sense of what really matters to human values, because human values are human. They're not godly. Human values are not trying to appease the vanity of some slave master whose feelings are hurt if you don't worship him the right way. That's not what morality is. Morality is, feeding people that are hungry and taking care of illness and trying to protect ourselves against disasters and trying to live in a world that has less social conflict. You know what I mean? That's where we live our real lives. So atheists and agnostics we don't even discover, we kind of find our moral value in the natural world that we live in, which is much better than a pretend supernatural basis for morality.
You mentioned William Lane Craig before, and more recently I've kind of had sort of an interest in reading up on his moral argument he likes to advance in a lot of his debates, particularly the responses to it, and I still have a really kind of a hard time grasping just what about divine command theory could possibly motivate us in our moral actions or moral decisions. Because it seems like even if you think God is the source of morality, there's still this question of, well, why should we care what God wants us to do, even if he's a perfectly good being, or even if there's a heaven after this life? But it seems like the humanist does have a better answer to that, doesn't he?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think you're right. And if it's true that morality comes from commands of a God who tells us what is right and wrong, then that actually means that you're not moral. That means that you don't have a morality. You don't have a thinking brain. What you're doing is you're just following order. There's the Nuremberg defense. And so if you get your morality from God, then whatever God says is good. And I've done this during debates a number of times. You can watch some of them online. The opponent will say what you said, that without some moral absolutes, without some external absolute that gives us right and wrong, we don't know how to be good or bad, and we're not smart enough, and we're not wise enough. We might think what we're doing is good, but in the big picture it's actually bad, and we need God to tell us, like a loving father talking to a toddler, right? Because the kids don't know everything, and so you need your parents to kind of hold your hand and tell you what's right or wrong. So I asked my opponent during debate, well, if morality comes down to obeying the commands of a God, then if God told you to kill me, would you do it? And the audience kind of hushes. And most of the time when I ask that question, the answer is some version of yes. In fact, some of them come right out and say, yes, it would be a sin and a crime not to obey God. Some of them say things like, they kind of stammer like, well, I don't think God would ever ask me to do something like that. And I said, but it's consistent with his character. Look at the God of the Old Testament. He told people to kill, kill, kill all the time, right?
Well, and isn't that presupposing that there's an independent standard for good? I mean, okay, so if God wouldn't do that, I mean, why? What's your reason for thinking that?
Well, because we're just too stupid. We're not wise enough. We're just little kids and we're slaves, and we can't, and it's dangerous for us to think for ourselves, because most parents, you don't want their kids always thinking for themselves. Parents want some parental control. And so God is supposedly this wise parent. So, one of my debate opponents said, I would have to seriously think about this and pray about it, but if I was sure that God was telling me to kill you, then I would have to consider it. And so, my response is that you have just abdicated morality. You don't have any moral judgment of your own. It's like Julia Sweeney in her play Letting Go of God, talking about God telling Abraham to sacrifice his own son, Isaac, as a test of his own piety and devotion. And Julia Sweeney says, well, the basic inbred instincts of a human parent to love and nurture and cherish their child is so beautiful. And, if God asked me to sacrifice my own child, isn't the proper answer, no, I will not sacrifice. I care more about human values than you do. And yet there's somehow something in a lot of people's minds that we have to simply just shut our brains and follow the slave master and do what the master tells us, or we're in trouble. This unwillingness to grow up and think for yourself, to remain a toddler, to have someone else do our own thinking for ourselves, that's very, very dangerous. And history shows how dangerous it is because, if God tells you to do it, then it would be wrong not to. We better kill. We better commit these holy wars and these genocides. And God knows, and even William Lane Craig defends the genocides of the Old Testament, the Amalekites and the Midianites, by saying, well, yeah, I'm sure you've read his defense. Only God knows how bad those Amalekites were, that it was better for those children to have been killed than to be growing up raised in such an evil society as the Amalekites were, so God knows better. And if you think about that, that's really an argument for abortion. Wouldn't it be better to abort a baby rather than have them risk the chance of being raised in an atheist family and losing their salvation and becoming evil, moral people? So command theory and Christian morality is really moral bankruptcy. It's a distrust of your own ability to think and reason and make moral judgments.
Well, I'd like to switch things up a bit in the last few minutes of this and talk about the separation of church and state, which I know is near and dear to your heart, being part of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. There's this common thing to hear in arguments a lot between theists and atheists, which is about the question of, does freedom of religion also mean freedom from religion?
Yeah, and part of it is the distinction in the English language. In many languages, there's no difference between those two words. In Spanish and in Portuguese, it's hard to distinguish the phrase freedom of religion from the phrase freedom from religion. It's the same word. You have to talk all around in a big circle. But to start, there are two basic reasons why we call ourselves the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And the first reason is that we think that in a secular country like the United States, our government must be free from religion. There has to be a separation. Our government has to be neutral. A secular government is not an anti-religious government. A secular government is simply a religiously neutral government, where the government says, you people are free to disagree among yourselves, but you're not free to ask the government to settle the argument. So that's a freedom from religion in the government, which is part of the reason our group is named what it's called. But also, a second reason is that we represent people who, as individuals in their daily lives, are actually free from religion, atheists and agnostics and free thinkers, live without any religion at all. So we have both of those. Ann Gaylor, who's the founder of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, says you can't have religious freedom if you don't have the freedom to dissent. There have to be those who say no, none of the above, no religion at all. So you can't have freedom of religion if you don't also have freedom from religion. If you don't have freedom from religion, then you are forced to be religious, and that's not freedom. True freedom requires freedom of and freedom from. Freedom of means if you're a believer, you can believe what you want. You can go to church, you can pay your tithe, you can wear your t-shirts, you can put nativity scenes on your front lawn, you can stand on your head and speak in tongues and pray to Mother Goose if you want to. That's the freedom of religion. But freedom from religion means there's a whole bunch of us, and we're a fastest growing plurality right now in this country, who have no religion at all. And for us, that's what it means, freedom from religion in all of those senses.
I think there seems to be this interpretation from a lot of certain religious believers that the phrase freedom from religion, I know Dinesh D'Souza has argued this, who I think you've debated, as well as a few other Christian apologists, but they seem to claim that the freedom from religion actually means that atheists want to just shove religion entirely out of the public square, and, you know, to the point that even people having their own private religious beliefs in politics is considered bad. But that's not what you would mean, is it?
Yeah, in fact, I've debated Dinesh 8 times now in as many states as well.
You are a patient man.
Well, and they're funny events, and I don't think we're going to debate anymore, you know, especially if he's in prison. It would be pretty hard to do. You heard that story.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
But what you're saying, though, is that, and I understand what you're saying, and I understand the Christians who raise that issue, like, You just want to chase God out of all life. In the minds of many of them, and they're not all the same. We have to be careful not to paint all Christians with the same brush, because it's only the Christian or the religious right that's the problem. There are a lot of moderate and liberal Christians who do understand the importance of state-church separation. In fact, many of them join our lawsuits. There's the Baptist Joint Committee on Religious Liberty. There's the Jewish Committee. I mean, there's a lot of good believers and Christians who understand state-church separation. It's just the extreme, religious right. But those people, like I used to be, the problem they have is they fail to distinguish between neutrality and hostility. Just like Jesus said. Jesus sort of reflected the small-town dictator mentality or cult leader mentality when he said, "He that is not with me is against me." They're unable to see that you can actually be neutral. There actually is a middle ground. Just because you're not with Jesus doesn't mean you're against him. You might just simply be not caring or not for, And so they think, and I used to think that, well, if you have a secular government where our nativity scene is disallowed on the steps of City Hall, that's hostility to religion. They see it that way. And even the New Testament, in Matthew and in the Beatitudes, blessed are you when men shall revile you and persecute you. There's a sort of persecution complex that a lot of them have. When secular does not mean anti-religious. It means that, we atheists aren't barging into churches. We're not interfering with the freedom of believers to believe. We simply think it should be an equal playing field. Believing and non-believing should be treated the same, and our government should be neutral at all levels.
Unfortunately, even though we do have a secular constitution and a secular government, it certainly seems like atheists are still coming under some attack in the public arena. And I just wonder if you'd have anything you'd like to comment on in that regard, especially with the Freedom from Religion Foundation dealing with some of what it deals with currently.
Yeah, well, remember that our work to keep state and church separate is not necessarily pro-atheistic. We're not asking for "In God We Trust" to come off the back of the judge's wall to be replaced with "God is a delusion and Jesus is a myth." We're not asking for that. We're asking for simple neutrality. But it still is true that when people are asked who they would be likely to vote for president, for example, or who they would want their child to marry, atheists are still at the bottom of that social totem pole. We've improved a lot.
Don't tell that to my girlfriend.
There's been some great improvements since the 1950s. It used to be like only 4 or 5% said they would vote for an atheist. Today, about 50% of Americans say they would, but that's still lower than who would vote for a gay or for a Muslim or for other types of people. Remember back when Kennedy was running, Catholics were at the bottom. A Catholic president, how can we have that? And today, now, most of the members of the U.S. Supreme Court are Catholic, so we've got past that hurdle. So atheism is still at the bottom of that political totem pole, but that's changing. And I don't know if it'll be in our lifetime, but that's going to change. Just like it has, there's been an atheist prime minister of Australia at least 3 times, and there's atheist non-believers in many other countries in the world, and it's no big deal. There should be no religious test for public office. People should be voted based on their abilities and their credentials, not whether they belong to the same church or have the same theology as you do.
And how much do you think that might be being influenced by the Atheist Out campaign that Richard Dawkins and others have been encouraging? Do you think that's helping to sway the tide at all?
Yeah, it is. There's parallels to the gay movement, The more gays came out and the more people realized that their niece and nephew and next door neighbor were gay, well, they're not such bad people. So that is part of it. Dawkins, our foundation had the first billboards that were called Out of the Closet way back in the mid 2000s. And Dawkins is doing the same thing, and Todd Stiefel's doing the same thing with a new campaign of his. And so it is happening. The more people know, especially with the internet, you can't hide anymore. I mean, you can't hide the flaws of religion anymore. So, yeah, part of that I think is just that our country is just growing up. We're starting to catch up with Europe, where, like in Denmark, for example, only 4 or 5% of the Danes actually say they believe in a God. Although half of them will get married in the church and they consider themselves cultural Christians, they're not really believers anymore. And so I think in the United States we're starting to see a good move in that direction to where your religious identity is not that important anymore. It's a private thing. It's important to you, but it's not important to your ability to be a political leader or governmental leader.
Right. Well, what's on the horizon then for the Freedom from Religion Foundation and for yourself? I know you mentioned before that you have a new book that's going to be coming out soon.
I do. Pitchstone Press. They're delaying the publication a while because they just got a new distributor, and we think that this will be the very first historical atheist book on the inspirational bookshelves. You know, when you go to the airport or the bookstore and you see these like Rick Warren and Joel Osteen, live your full life, find your true purpose, 7 steps to have, you know those kind of books. There's never been one about an atheist, by an atheist. So my new book is called Life-Driven Purpose, How an Atheist Finds Meaning. And the foreword is by Daniel Dennett, the philosopher Daniel Dennett. So answering all these supposed purpose-driven life people, it should be out at the end of this year. It can already be pre-ordered, but I'm pretty excited because it's addressing that very question you were raised. What's the meaning? Why are we here? What's the purpose of life? Is life just an empty, nihilistic despair because there's no God? Or do atheists have a really firm, positive, joyful, meaningful basis to live their lives? So I'm looking forward to that. It'll be fun. The foundation is in the middle of a lot of lawsuits. You know, we won a legal victory against the IRS in federal court over the parsonage allowance, the pastor's housing allowance, and the U.S. government. Obama's administration has challenged our victory and has appealed to the Seventh Circuit. The briefs are in. There are going to be oral arguments on that. So that's what we do as an organization. We love to sue the government, or even if you don't sue, we love to change the government to become more secular. So watch for news about the outcome of that decision in the next few months.
Well, I have to say I'm pretty excited to hear about your book that you've got coming out, because I personally feel like we could use more discussion about purpose within the atheist community. I know there's some books that do touch on it and sort of, give it a little bit of treatment, but it would be nice to have something that's sort of like our alternative to the purpose-driven life. I remember even when I was still a Christian reading that book and in a small group study and just thinking, this is really bad. I mean, it's not really even good inspirational writing, so I don't really understand the appeal, but it'll still be nice to have our own alternative to that.
Well, it's because The Purpose-Driven Life is a great title. So, and you're right. I read the book and some of the other books of his, and they, there's nothing new. There's nothing like, wow, he came up with some truth. If you haven't read the book, I'll save you the trouble. According to Rick Warren, the purpose of life is to know God, to believe in God, to know God, to glorify God, to go to church, and to get other people to come to church with you. That's it. That's the purpose. That's the purpose of life. That's why you are on this planet. You don't get to choose your purpose. God chose it for you, and that's what it is. So if you read his books, you're not going to find anything more than that in it, but I guess there's an awful lot of people who need to be told something like that, because those books are very, very popular.
Well, the nice thing that I've found about that is that when people say that, they often also leave a lot of wiggle room in there about what their purpose from God can be. It can be ministry, it can be music, it can be science, basically whatever subjective purpose they want it to be, even though they pretend like it's an objective, external purpose from God.
Yeah, well, I used to preach, though, that, we were the body of Christ, and there were different members of the body, and there were different gifts, and some people were endowed by God with certain skills and gifts so that they could be a different part of the same body of Christ, But I always thought it was interesting that God always called me exactly where I wanted to go, which is kind of, it's kind of like what Muhammad's wife said to Muhammad. How come these revelations from Muhammad are always the things that you want to have done in your own personal life, Or Joseph Smith's wife said that, Mormonism, the same idea. God's always telling him these things that are what he wants to be doing. And look, they both started these massive world religions over this, their own personal desires.
Well, if people would like to find out more about you or your organization, or even where they could pre-order your book that's coming out, where could they do that?
Well, the Freedom from Religion Foundation is easy to find. Just, Google it these days. Or go to ffrf.org. That's short for Freedom from Religion Foundation.org. And, we sell books. We talk about our legal strategy. We publish. We have a newspaper. You can join the foundation for $40 a year, which is a lot better bargain than tithing once a week to your local church, because we have to print the paper and mail it, so we have some expenses. And then you can also find my book, Godless and Losing Faith in Faith. And I have some children's books, too, Maybe Yes, Maybe No, and Maybe Right, Maybe Wrong, addressing the scientific method and then addressing morality for children. And I have a book called The Good Atheist, which really talks about the immense contributions made to the world by atheists and agnostics.
That sounds pretty awesome. Well, thank you, Dan, so much for being on the show, and best of luck to you in your future endeavors.
Well, thank you, Taylor. I'm happy to know that you will not be praying for us. So.
No, I will not.
That's good.
I'd like to thank Dan Barker for coming on the show. If you'd like to find out more about him or purchase any of his books, links are available in the description for this episode at godlesshaven.com. At godlesshaven.com, you can also find out more about the show, more about myself, and plenty of additional content. Music in the show is my own work. Thank you for listening, and please join me again in the not-too-distant future for another episode of Armchair Atheism.